It's my pleasure and honor to be welcoming on to the Grand Dark Conspiracy Benjamin Radford. He's written the book Mysterious New Mexico, Miracles, Magic, and Monsters in the Land of Enchantment. If you're not familiar with Benjamin, I hope that you will do the job out there and go out to granddarkconspiracy.com, link up to his website, and get yourself familiar with Benjamin. He is probably one of the foremost investigators of the paranormal. And he offers actually reasonable explanations for most of the things that he investigates, because he actually goes out and does actual investigations and in a more scientific manner and applies scientific method to these cases that he investigates. As opposed to some people who think they do, he actually does. So this is why it's always exciting to have the opportunity to talk to Benjamin and get his ideas and thoughts on what's going on out there. And this book, Mysterious New Mexico, does just that. Welcome to the Grand Dark Conspiracy, Benjamin. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. You can call me Ben. It's fine.
All right. I'll call you Ben. So, Mysterious New Mexico, how did this book come together for you to put together and to do it? Because you got to go to all these places, too, which I thought was really neat.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of funny how the whole book came about. As you mentioned, this is my 7th book. I've done 6 other books, and my 5th book, I guess chronologically, was called Tracking the Chupacabra, the vampire based in fact fiction folklore, where it was sort of the culmination and results of 5 years of researching the famous vampiric beast, and I wrote up that book, and I and many other people believe solved that mystery finally after it being out there in the internet and all over the world. And I did that for UNM Press, University of Mexico Press, which is actually, I'm an alum of UNM. I have a degree in psychology from there. And so that book came out in 2010, 2011 or something. And, you know, it was well received and people enjoyed it. And my editor over at UNM Press said, hey, you know, I know that you're doing these investigations and write-ups, around the world. I mean, I've done stuff in South America and in Africa and Europe and elsewhere. And he said, what about your own home state? What about here in New Mexico? There's all sorts of weirdness here. And I'm like, well, that's certainly true. So it was sort of, so that was sort of germinated the idea of, well, why not go ahead and spend some time researching some of the better known mysteries in my home state where I grew up. And so that's basically what I did. That was what was the seed for Mysterious New Mexico. And I had done some of these investigations. There's the book is actually a collection of 13 cases, ranging everything from there's a couple of haunted house ghost cases. There's several miracle stories, miracle claims. There's giants in the sky, sort of monsters. There's La Llorona ghosts. And there's UFO crashes. There's all sorts of weirdness out there. And some of the I had sort of done over the years are the ones the other investigations I had conducted specifically for this book. So it was basically sort of a roundup, if you will, of some of New Mexico's not only better known mysteries, but also just ones that I found were ones that I thought had been overlooked. For example, I do discuss the 1947 Roswell crash. But I don't go into that in depth just because it's been done before. There's no shortage of books on Roswell, both believer and skeptical. And I didn't want to just rehash something that someone else has already done. My interest is in trying to bring something new to it and trying to bring actual field research and critical thinking and investigation to it. So that's sort of what I wanted to try to do with the book.
Well, that's one of the great things about the book, is because there is actual, research done. It seems to me a lot of these legends would not persist as they are if someone had just done a little bit of scholarly work and maybe looked at some microfiche or done something other than just regurgitation of these folktales, which I understand that's how these things persist and spread. But, just right off of the book, right off the bat, I believe the first case that you look into at the it's at a theater. I can't remember. Its name is escaping me right now.
The Chemo Theater.
The chemotherapy. Yeah.
Chemo Theater.
Theater.
Almost chemotherapy. But
almost.
The Chemo Theater.
That's just what wanted to come out of my mouth was chemotherapy. But the Chemo Theater with the ghost of Bobby, the little boy, and that quickly unraveled for you. I mean, or not maybe for you, but for the people who were perpetuating the story.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, and you bring up a very good point. People often ask me, well, how do these stories get perpetuated and arise? And from a folkloric point of view, that's one of the most interesting parts for me is trying to figure out, where did this come from? Because, ghost stories and for that matter, Bigfoot and UFO monsters or all those other things, they don't appear in a vacuum. There's always some context. There's always some reason why people are going to this and claiming this is some sort of supernatural paranormal event. And exactly for the reason that you talked about, a lot of these mysteries just keep going and going and going because there is very little scholarly research in this. And I don't want to sound like I'm the only person doing it. I mean, there are others doing it, but if you look at the vast majority of the books and magazine articles and blogs about these subjects, the subjects that I've written in Mysterious New Mexico, and even for that matter, the subjects I've tackled in my previous books, including Scientific Paranormal Investigation, Lake Monster Mysteries, and also the Chupacabra book. The vast bulk of it, I would probably say 90 to 95% of it, is simply rehashed, regurgitated, just so stories. It's, people who, they're well-meaning people. I mean, I don't think they're trying to deceive anybody, but they're not familiar with good scholarship and good research. And because I come from both an academic and background and also a journalistic background, I'm used to doing good research. I don't mind spending hours in the library. I don't mind looking for original sources and all that sort of thing. To me, that's part of what you should do. But a lot of the books, they plagiarize each other and they sort of repeat stories and it has this sort of snowball effect where, if you look up some of the subjects that I investigate online, there's dozens and hundreds of different websites and stories about it, but they're actually not that different. They actually just sort of copy each other. If you actually take a close look at them, there's a lot of repetition. There's maybe a handful of ones that are regurgitated and rehashed and spread around, with almost nobody bothering to say, well, hold on here. Yes, this is a good story, but is it true? How just because someone said it doesn't make it true. It doesn't mean it's not true, but it just means you can't take it at face value. And that was certainly the case with the Chemo Theater ghost. And I'm actually particularly proud of that case. I'm glad you brought that one up because it's a fascinating, at least to me, is sort of dismantling of how a modern ghost story came about. And to this day, I mean, I'm here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and for years, every Halloween, and I'm sure this Halloween next month, there's going to be people repeating the story of the Chemo Theater ghost and little Bobby Darnall who died there and whose ghost is said to still haunt the place. It's well known not only in New Mexico but throughout the Southwest, and yet when you start looking into it after a while, the pieces fall apart, and it's the Chemo story is especially interesting to me just because I was able to I had a co-investigator named Mike Smith, and he were able to essentially track down the origin of these things and prove that the widely told story about the Chemo Theater ghost can't be true. That doesn't mean it's not a fascinating story, and this is one of the points that I try to make to people. Like, oh, well, you're always debunking stuff. I don't try to debunk things. I try to investigate things. And in the process of investigating, yes, oftentimes I end up disproving it. But that doesn't mean that I'm going into it trying to debunk or disprove. I don't care. This is, I don't have a vested interest in this. If there truly is a ghost in a haunted location or in a repeatedly haunted location, I want to see it. I want to be there. I want to, photograph it and touch it and capture it and play with it. And, who wouldn't? And same thing with, Bigfoot or anything else. So it's not that I have any axe to grind in terms of, I'm just trying to figure out what the answer is. And if the answer is that at the end of the day, after the investigation is done, that there actually is little or no truth to it, then that's interesting as well. And that's sort of what I try to do with my book, is to bring the readers along with me and say, look, this is the story, and this is how I went about investigating it, and come check it out and see what I did.
Well, that's one of the things that I truly appreciate about what you do. If you didn't leave open the opportunity for something to be unexplained, which I know, and there's another case in here which you talk about, you almost walked away having to say that, something is happening other than what I can explain by these experiments. You would just accept that as what it is, but you've been able to kind of look at these cases, find reasonable explanations for them, and move forward. And there's nothing wrong with that. If anybody has an issue with that, then they actually have an issue with hearing the truth, which is kind of scary. But I think there's probably an explanation for that as well, because I think a lot of people want to believe things that they're going to believe them no matter what. But you're out there, you're doing actual work. You're in the dirt, specifically in some of the cases here, you're actually literally in the dirt. And you're getting your hands dirty. You're out there investigating. You're doing your due process, which, I would think it would be a really big boon to people who are out there trying to look at paranormal things. If they didn't go into it with an already decided vantage point, trying to either prove or disprove, they just went out to investigate and to look at all the things and then make a decision or present the evidence that they come out with as actual evidence, as opposed to, it's that whole going into it with a preconceived notion changes how you investigate. And I don't see you doing that. When I read the book, I don't read that you want to go out there. Like you said, you don't have a vested interest in disproving this, because guess what? If Ben Radford finds a ghost, that's news. That's bigger news.
Absolutely.
That's bigger news than not finding a ghost. I mean,
absolutely. Yeah, and no, I mean, you're exactly right, and that's why I'm glad that comes through in the book. Is look, there's lots and lots and lots of books on ghosts and unexplained and paranormal, this and that and the other. I mean, I've got bookshelves lined with them, and what I've often found, particularly in ghost investigations, but also some with crop circles and Bigfoot and other things like that, is that a lot of times with ghost cases in specific. If you really look at what they're doing, they're just repeating ghost stories. It's, I'm a ghost investigator, and I went there and I talked to this person. He told me he saw this and this, and you're like, okay, well that's fine. I mean, I interview eyewitnesses as well. My question is, then what do you do with that? How do you prove or disprove that what they told you is true? And a lot of times they don't bother to do it. It's just sort of like, oh well, here's all these stories that are told here. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I have a background in folklore, and I love that sort of thing. But that's only the very first step in the process. That's not the end result. The first step is getting the evidence and the claims. From there, you go and say, okay, well, this is interesting, and could this be true? And you interview the people, and you see, is there independent third party evidence that can corroborate this? Yes or no? And if there isn't, that doesn't mean that the person is lying or hoaxing. It just means that it's an anecdote. It's not something that's testable, or what in science we call falsifiable. So we can't prove it's true or not true.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest problem with the paranormal investigation, by and large, besides the fact that they're trying to grab something nebulous and that there is no real. It's like if you have an EMF detector and it goes off, that's fantastic, but it doesn't tell you what the causation is. So exactly. You can't leap to ghost. It's kind of like if you see a UFO, you can't leap to extraterrestrials. You can just say, I don't know what that is in the sky. And that's really where I think we run into problems in paranormal investigation is, as trying to be or purporting to be so scientific, is that really there's lots of leaps that shouldn't be happening. And instead of just presenting the facts, they're presenting the facts plus, subjective experience plus preconceived ideas about what these phenomena are.
You're exactly right. I mean, and that's one of the things in a previous book I wrote called Scientific Paranormal Investigation, How to Solve Unexplained Mysteries. I talk a lot about the process, and I talk about how, if you're going to investigate these mysterious phenomena, then that's great. I mean, I encourage that. I do that myself, but you have to take it seriously. You have to want to solve the mystery. You can't just sort of do this half-assed, like, oh, wow, I'm a ghost hunter. I'm going to walk around, a building at 2 a.m. with the lights off, take a bunch of photos and videos and audio, and then comb through it for days later, and then see if we can find something weird. That's not scientific. That's not it's actually what I call anomaly hunting. You're essentially creating your own bogus evidence and a lot of red herrings, and so you have to go with what the original claim is. And a lot of the paranormal investigation, particularly ghost investigation, because that's by far the most popular, due in part, I would argue, to the Ghost Hunters TV show, which is, I think, now in its 10th or 11th season of not finding hard evidence of ghosts. But it's and that's how a lot of people envision this. And so if you look in my book, I've got 2 or 3 chapters on ghosts, and people who follow the Ghost Hunters on TV are like, oh, well, Ben Radford's looking for ghosts. Does he bring out his EMF detector? Actually, I do once, just to show that it actually doesn't work. And so what you find is that the techniques and the most important equipment you can have for investigating is logic and science and good scientific methodologies. It's not you can't rely on gadgets from Radio Shack to find these things. It's a matter of it's good old fashioned detective work and analysis, and that's the key. It's you can't turn to gadgets for these things. You have to know what you're doing.
Well, that's one of the things I notice. I talk to a lot of people about, these, paranormal investigators. I talk to them all the time. It seems to me the more advanced investigators kind of move away from the techno movement, and they take great notes. They might take an audio recorder to kind of do audio notes, not so much,
Sure.
And a pencil and paper. And that's how they conduct it. And it seems to me that they have better results as far as recording the events that they encounter, but at the same time they're also very well aware that this is not necessarily evidence, but that it's subjective. And I think that's a very important thing for people to differentiate between what evidence actually is, which is an objective, observable object, whatever that may be, and something that is subjective does not really fit into evidence. That's anecdotal. That's just how you feel about something, not so much
right.
What actually happened or what somebody else can look at and say, okay, I can accept that as fact. Let's look into why this happened.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So when you were at the Chemo Theater specifically, I thought was great. There were so many different layers to the case. Specifically, one, there was the tragedy of the boy who died there during, I think it was like a boiler explosion or something along that line, during a showing. And then,
it was a little boy named Bobby Darnall Jr., who died during there was a boiler explosion in this particular theater in downtown Albuquerque in August of 1951. He was there with some other kids, and a boiler exploded in the lobby, and there were over a dozen people injured, but he was the most seriously injured, and he ended up dying.
And there the reports of his haunting didn't start till like several years later. I mean, like, I believe that I'm thinking I know 1986 is when this all kind of started kicking off.
Right.
And people started talking about the ghost, and there's donuts involved. So
it's a strange story. That was one of the things that was most intriguing to me. It was that if the story is true, and I'll highlight that phrase advisedly, if the story is true, it's one of the best known, best documented poltergeist cases in the world, because you have these reports that Bobby's ghost, this little 6-year-old's ghost, who was not given the donuts that he wanted, because of course ghost boys eat donuts, because why wouldn't they?
Exactly.
He became upset, and he, depending on which source you read, he ruined a play of Christmas Carol one year. And according to other stories, it happened several times, but certainly there's at least one very famous one in which all sorts of things went wrong. The actors forgot their lines, they tripped over things, props on the stage opened or closed, doors, windows, things like that. Things moved, actors felt they were tripped and pushed. The light gels fluttered down the stage. It was basically an unmitigated disaster, and paranormal events were going on live on stage, not only to the cast and crew, but to the audience. So if the story is true, then in this case, there were literally hundreds of people who were first-hand eyewitnesses to essentially what's poltergeist activity. And so that was one of the reasons that I was intrigued by it, was that here's this whole story, and I heard about it before, and yet it seemed that even though the story had been repeated many times, again, it was all sort of just rehashing the same details, and no one bothering to do any actual research investigation to verify the parts of the story. It was just sort of like, oh, here's the story, here's what happened. Now let's wander around, with our EMF detectors and see what we can find.
Well, the irony doesn't escape me that this happened during a play about ghosts. So
yes, that's true. That's true.
There's at least 3 or 4 spirits. No, there's 4 spirits in that play, Christmas Carol, and then of course we have this little boy spirit purported to be running amok and screwing up the play for all these actors. But what was amazing to me, like as you relate the story in the beginning to investigate, it happened on your very first phone call that it became clear that there's not as much to the story as what is being related.
Yeah, it was strange because, again, one of the first things that I do as an investigator is there's a lot of pre-research. There's a lot of, before you even set foot in a location, you need to do your research. You have to do the background time collecting different stories and different accounts and different versions of the chemo theater story, both from in local books and also online and elsewhere. I mean, at some point you get to the point where there's just hundreds of stories and they're all just repeats of each other. And so you get diminishing returns because online, especially, you're just seeing the exact same story that's just appearing different places. But so that was the first trick was getting all the information there and then parsing it out. And the very first thing was to establish, well, what year was it? Because some stories said that it was 1974, some said that it was later in the 80s. And so, you got to know what decade it was if you can investigate this. And so one of the very first things we did was to find out that, in fact, the most commonly given date for the supernaturally ruined performance, which was in 1974, was wrong. This isn't just a matter of opinion, because at the time, the chemo theater was not a theater at all. It was not a stage theater. It was actually a porno place. So it was an adult movie theater. And so by definition, they didn't have a play of A Christmas Carol being performed on Christmas Day in 74. It was a porno called Teenage Fantasies. So, okay, well, that's not true. So then the question is, well, what date was it? And eventually, through some detective work, Mike and I determined that it was actually in 1980s, 86, 87. I forgot which one of the two. And we nailed it down, and we figured out which one it was. And so we contacted the people in the play, because one of the things that happened was that the Dennis Potter, who's the current technical director and was there at the time, he said all this happened. He said, look, this is a true story. And this is one of the things that surprised me when I first went into it. I kind of expected it would be sort of like, well, it's all friend of a friend story, urban legend stuff. And this never really happened to anybody. But much to my surprise and pleasure, I have to say, I found somebody still working at the chemo theater to this very day who was there that night, that day when the haunting happened. And he said, yeah, this happened. I was there. He gave a very vivid description. So this was really interesting to me, is I found a first-person eyewitness account to this famously supernaturally ruined performance. But then the next question is, okay, well, who else saw it? I mean, we need independent eyewitnesses. And so, so to get to your point, I called up Andrew Shea, who directed the play. I mean, he was once we knew what the year was, then we could contact people in that play and say, what do you remember about this performance? Did you really feel ghosts touching you and all these things? And he said, no, it went great. I was like, are we talking about the same play? Because, the story is that, on this, there's a Christmas Carol in this production, and they took the donuts down, and this angered the boy ghost, and the whole play was supernaturally ruined. He's like, no, none of that happened. I don't know what you're talking about. And I was like, okay, well, we got a problem here, because we have two different people, both who claimed to be there on that day and were presumably, credible. I mean, I don't think anyone's lying to me. People, and yet we have completely different recollections of what happened. And of course, I wasn't there, and you weren't there. I wasn't there, and so so I have no independent way of verifying this other than to track down eyewitnesses at the time who would presumably, if the story is true, corroborate both Dennis Potter and the popular versions of the story.
We're talking with Ben Radford. The book is Mysterious New Mexico, Miracles, Magic, and Monsters in the Land of Enchantment. Links are up at grandarkconspiracy.com for you to go ahead and link up to Benjamin's website, as well as links for you to get the book through Amazon. So I would encourage you to do so, because if you really want to see some good methodology applied to paranormal research, this is a pretty good template for you to kind of follow and kind of understand. If you really want to get results and solve some mysteries as opposed to perpetuate them, this is a good example for you. You're listening to the Grand Dark Conspiracy on WQTT 1270 AM, streaming online at QT1270.com. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and we'll be right back. And we're back from break. We've got Benjamin Radford on the line with us. Mysterious New Mexico, Miracles, Magic, and Monsters in the Land of Enchantment is the book. Going out to grandarkconspiracy.com. Link up to Ben's website, and you'll find more about him. You'll find some of the other books that he has out there, tracking the Chupacabra. And that's one that I do love, because it really... I put to bed a mystery, and I think it's a lot of information that people are not aware of. Now, whenever I talk to somebody about the Chupacabra, Ben, I tell them about the bird down in, I believe, Texas. So I believe in Chupacabra, but it's just a little bird that is kind of
the whippoorwill. That's right, the goat-sucking whippoorwill.
Yes, the Texas whippoorwill, and it's got a symbiotic relationship with goats. That's why it's and people are like, what? I don't know. But anyway, getting back to the book, with the chemo theater, you unraveled this mystery pretty quickly. You started to get stories that were contradictory. And, when you looked into it, those began to outweigh the one source that you had for the legendary performance.
Yeah, I mean, this is again, it was interesting, because when I first began researching it, I honestly thought that it was just going to be a dead end pretty quickly, because it was just going to be like, that's a story they told, but I can't really track it down any first-person eyewitnesses. It's just sort of one of millions of ghost stories. But I was surprised and frankly somewhat shocked to find that no, there actually was the current manager, technical director at Chemo Theater, who again is still there to this day, who was there that night. And so I actually had in front of me a first person eyewitness to the whole issue, which gave it much more credibility to me. And so I was much more intrigued at that point. And then the question became, well, who else saw this? I mean, in theory, this was eyewitnessed by hundreds of people, not just Dennis Potter. And so there should be dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of people that I could interview to get the story. And, what did you see? Did you see a ghost? Did you, was this supernatural? How did you interpret it? And to the contrary, when we began contacting people who were there in that performance, they didn't know anything about it. In some cases, they'd never even heard of the Bobby story. They didn't know that the play that they were doing, the Christmas Carol, was even connected to any ghost story at all. That was news to them. And so, as we talked to a handful of people, all of them said, I don't know what you're talking about. That didn't happen. So at that point, point, then we said, well, whole problem, because we've got contradicting eyewitnesses. And so in order to sort of get an even more objective point of view, we looked into the newspaper theater reviews. Because again, if the story is true, if the widely told story of the Chemo Theater story is true, then surely it would have been noted at the time. You know, there were theater reviews both in the Albuquerque Journal and the Albuquerque Tribune, which is now defunct, but it was operating at the time. And we looked for reviews, and there was nothing in the reviews. They were all very positive. There was no mention at all of any supernatural weirdness going on, nothing paranormal, no ghost. It was like, yeah, it was a good show. And we even contacted Ollie Reed, who's a former theater reviewer at the time, and he's still around. Actually, operates. He works for a bookstore in Albuquerque, and he said, "No, I don't remember anything about it." And so, you know, at some point, you have to say, "Hold on here." I mean, the simple fact is that we have one eyewitness, a very credible, nice, knowledgeable guy, who claims that this happened, and nobody else. Not a single other person says that happened. And you know, so then the problem is, well, you know, I don't want to call Dennis Potter a liar, because I don't think he's lying. I mean, I met him several times. He's a very nice guy. He's got glasses, and he's balding, and he's really funny and interesting, and he's fun to talk to. And, you know, I don't think he's a liar. I don't think that he's a hoaxer. I don't think that he intentionally fabricated the Chemo Theater ghost story for fame or attention or anything else. I think he's just simply misremembered. I think he misunderstood. And so, and that's sort of the conclusion I come to in the book. And again, whenever possible, I actually go out of my way not to call people liars and hoaxers. Part of that is because I have a background in psychology. I have a degree in psychology from me, and I'm very well aware of the ways in which we can fool ourselves and we can fool each other. And it's not intentional. It's not. There's no malevolence. There's no trying to deceive. It's just we honestly misremember things. We honestly misperceive things. It doesn't mean you're stupid or crazy. It just means you're human. We all do it. This is not pathological. It's something that we all do on some level throughout our lives, but we don't notice it until someone calls us on it, or we have some other way of sort of cross-checking that against you know, the historical record or facts. And it was the same thing with my Chupacabra investigation. You know, that I ended up tracking down Madeline Tolentino, who was the very first and the original Chupacabra eyewitness in Puerto Rico, and I tracked her down and interviewed her, and I think that she misunderstood something that she saw and mistook it as Chupacabra. And so in that book as well, I mean, I go out of my way to say, look, no one's calling anybody liars or hoaxers. I think it's just a simple misunderstanding, and that's really what I think happened, and that's why the Chemo Theater investigation is especially fascinating for a variety of reasons. One of them is that when you know the story, when you know the whole full story, it's a fascinating blend of mistakes and misinformation and folklore and misunderstandings and investigation. There's so many different elements to it, and it all comes together.
You know, it just seems to be, it's a nice little folktale, but I mean, even when the purported or the alleged happenings were going on the stage, you know, they didn't seem all that spectacular. People tripping over lines, and you know, actors forget lines all the time. People trip over stuff all the time. To me, I would almost like, if that were happening, other than the self-opening and closing doors and stuff like that moving around, you know, the RSPK type of situation, okay, fine. If that's happening, that's amazing. But the rest of the stuff seems pretty mundane, you know, commonplace almost for like a first performance.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, that was one of the interesting parts of this. I was trying to understand, you know, why, assuming for a minute that Dennis is a sincere, nice, credible guy who keeps telling the story of this haunted performance that did not happen, then the question is why. And I interviewed him at length, of course, for the book and everything. And you know, what he told me was that he says, he basically made the same point that you just did. He said, look, you know, there's nothing unusual about things going wrong in a play. Plays are difficult. They involve lots of different people. People don't show up on time. People forget their lines. It involves lights and timing and sound. There's so many different aspects to a play, just as there are for a film or anything else. That it would be unusual if something didn't go wrong. I mean, there's so many working parts to it that that doesn't mean that things go wrong all the time. That detract from the play, but just that people are human. Putting on a play is not easy under the best of circumstances, including when you're dealing with kids. And so what he said was that look, if these things had happened over the course of many months or even years, it wouldn't have seemed unusual or odd. Because, as you point out, people forget their lines, lights explode sometimes, weird things happen. But he said the fact that they all happened in the course of one performance was what made him think that there was a ghost involved or something supernatural. And so what I think happened, as best I can parse it out, because again, I can't read his mind. I don't have access to any journal that he made. I have no way of knowing. My best guess is that misremembered, and that there were in fact ordinary, mishaps that happened over the course of weeks or months, where an actor forgets to show up, or someone trips over a line, or a prop falls over in the middle of the scene, whatever. And in his mind, they sort of collected and coalesced into his misremembering them as all happening in one time, whereas in fact they happened over the course of weeks or months, and therefore they would not be unexplainable and mysterious in that context. So I think he basically just misremembered a collection of things happening at one time. And again, no one else remembered that. I mean, there was one case of where the director, Andrew Shea, he said, the kids were, because part of the story is the kids were late because they had actually just come from a Star Trek film, and that turns out it was true. So the kids were late to the show, but it didn't. They were late the kids were late on set, but they weren't. They still had their parts, and it all worked out fine. But they were just later. They were later there than they should have been. So everybody admits that. I mean, Dennis remembers that, and so does Andrew Shea and others. But beyond that, it was a fine performance.
That's probably the most supernatural thing, is that the fact that those kids got to go enjoy Star Trek IV, A Voyage Home, which, is a cinema classic. Also, one thing, I'm going to take, a little stab at the logic and reason here and thinking, I'm going to dismiss the Bobby ghost, and I'm going to say because it was over donuts, it was Homer Simpson's ghost.
Could be. Weird things have happened.
We're talking with Ben Radford, and this book is magnificent, and I would encourage anyone to go out to grandarkconspiracy.com and link up and get yourself a copy of it. It's Mysterious New Mexico, Miracles, Magic, and Monsters in the Land of Enchantment. Like I said, it's a great book, and I would encourage all the listeners to go out and get that. And also to link up to Ben's website so you can, there's a lot of information out there. Benjamin is out there. He writes articles for tons of different publications. He contributes to, so much, and there's so much information out there. So link up to his website at grandarkconspiracy.com. We're going to go ahead and take this break right here at the top of the hour, and we'll be right back.
WQTT Marysville. News, sports, weather, and great oldies.
And we're back. Ben Radford's on the line with us. We're talking Mysterious New Mexico with him. Links are up at grandarkconspiracy.com for you to go to his website, as well as get yourself a copy of the book. This book covers a lot of ground, Ben. You've got cryptids, you've got UFOs, you've got ghosts, you've got miracles, you've got all these things encompassed, and it's in a relatively small geographical area. And one of the things that I find very interesting is the Thunderbirds, which is something that, a lot of people maybe aren't familiar with, but the giant birds, sometimes people say they're pterosaurs or this boggles my mind, is because this is something that if people are seeing it, it shouldn't be a small sample of people seeing it. It should be something that's, hugely recognizable. And even if there's on a migratory trail, witnesses, I think, would be popping up all over the place, and it would be pretty commonplace. But that's not the fact, is it?
No, and that was one of the reasons that sort of drew me to the Thunderbird story, was that, it has all the elements that I love. I mean, I've always been fascinated by monsters. I've written about Bigfoot, and of course I did a book with Joe Nickell called Lake Monster Mysteries. So I've done books on lake monsters and Ogopogo and all sorts of other stuff, and of course the Chupacabra. And so I've always been fascinated by this notion that there are large, unseen, unknown animals that basically coexist with us, that are just beyond our grasp. They're out there, but we can't prove they're out there. They're only seen, in dubious eyewitness accounts and fuzzy photographs every year or two. I just find that idea fascinating because, as you point out, I mean, that either these things are out there or they're not. I mean, this is not the subject of opinion in terms of whether they exist or not. It's not like, if 52% of the world thinks that the Loch Ness Monster exists, something that pops into existence, just outside of Inverness. Same thing with Bigfoot or anything else. And so, if these things are truly out there, if these animals, and I use that word advisedly because people need to remember that when we're talking about Bigfoot, we're talking about the Loch Ness Monster or Chupacabra or Thunderbirds. There can't just be one of them. A lot of times I hear people, the Bigfoot, like, as if there's one Bigfoot who's like running really fast all across the country and catching boats to Nepal to go be seen there in the Himalayas or else. No, if these are real animals. And again, this goes back to what I was talking about before about taking these investigations and these subjects seriously. If these are actually living, breathing animals that fit in with our knowledge of zoology and biology and taxonomy, then they have to act like animals. They have to eat things. They have to eat other animals and plants. They have to reproduce. They have to leave scat. Some of them have to die. They have to be bones. They have to be fur. There has to be scale. There has to be something there. And so, this is important to remember, particularly when you're looking at the breeding populations. And so, breeding population is what scientists talk about when they say that this is why, for example, if you have a species that there's only a handful of members surviving, they're doomed. If there's the dodo and other birds like that and other animals like that, at some point there's just too few of them to survive. There may be a couple dozen, but they can't. There's not enough variation in the gene pool for them, so they're just going to sort of die a lonely death. Same thing with the Tasmanian tiger and others. And so, in the case of Bigfoot, for example, the estimate is that there would have to be between 6,000 and 10,000 Bigfoot in North America alone. 6,000 to 10,000 of them. Think about that. North America. So the question isn't, why aren't we finding 5,000 Bigfoot in North America? The question isn't, why are we finding 500 or 100 or a dozen? We can't even find one of them out of the thousands and thousands that would have to be there. And the same thing with the Thunderbirds. If there truly are these unknown, huge, and we're not talking things the size of a firefly. I mean, these are things the size of a small plane. The question is, where are they? If these things are truly out there, if these eyewitnesses are accurate in their descriptions, and I give a couple examples in that chapter, then the question is, where are they? Why aren't they routinely sighted? Not only by pilots who are crisscrossing the skies. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of airplane flights, both regional, commercial, every day across the Southwest, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, Mexico. I mean, there's ample opportunity, especially for something that's that big. You can't miss these. These are giant creatures, and not only by airline pilots, by ornithologists, or even by Google Maps, Google Earth, right? I mean, these days you have satellites in the air that can photograph your house from space. Okay, so even objects as small as a car and smaller than that. So just by sheer logic, you would expect to find regularly expect to find photographs of not only Bigfoot but the Loch Ness Monster and giant Thunderbirds appearing in these satellite images. Not every day, but certainly every now and then, because there's so many satellites in the skies that it doesn't make sense that all these giant large creatures would somehow not be captured on camera at some point, even accidentally.
Specifically with the Thunderbirds, more than even like Sasquatch, because at least with Sasquatch, I guess you can say he hides under the cover of woods, and he maybe crosses the street every once in a while. But with the Thunderbirds, the only way they'll be out there is they're out in the open. I mean, you're not. To me, that's the one that really sticks out to me. Like, why wouldn't we have something on this? Because one, the nature of birds, and if they're migratory, which I'm guessing a bird that would be this big, even if it's not migratory, would have a huge range for you're probably talking 100 to 200 mile range from its habitat. A typical hawk or something along that, a raptor, is going to be around 5 miles. So you extrapolate that out to this 14 foot, 15 foot eyewitness account. These wings that span the cross highways. They're going to have a wide range, and everybody's going to see them. It's not going to be a single sole witness. It's going to be 50 people from several different vantage points. It's not going to be easily dismissed.
Exactly, and that's especially true if you spend time in the Southwest. I mean, again, I live in New Mexico. I'm very familiar with our skyline. And outside of the Rio Grande Valley, which is right next to, of course, the Rio Grande River, and some parts of the state that are mountainous, for example, the Sandias and the Pecos and the Jemez, for example, most of New Mexico is wide open. Especially down in Las Cruces. I mean, that chapter, the Thunderbird chapter, opens with an eyewitness sighting in Las Cruces, which is in southern New Mexico, not far from Texas, And yes, there's some mountains there, but there ain't much else, and there's simply nowhere for these creatures to hide. You could maybe hide somewhere, but they have to migrate. They have to go places to find food, and it's just simply not plausible that these creatures are out there. Again, this is in the Pacific Northwest. There's open skies 360 degrees, and surely some telephone lineman or some college kid or some long distance trucker or an airplane pilot or a cop or pretty much anybody would see these things on a regular basis. Maybe not every day, but certainly every few weeks, if these things are as big and as populous as is claimed.
We're talking with Benjamin Radford. The book is Mysterious New Mexico. Going out to grandarkconspiracy.com, a link up to his website there, as well as get yourself a copy of the book by clicking on the link, and it'll go right into Amazon. And I guarantee you won't be disappointed with the read. And there's a lot of ground to be covered as far as what's in the book. It covers pretty much the whole wide spectrum of what is considered paranormal today, as far as by that definition. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and we'll be right back. And we're back. We have Benjamin Radford with us tonight, and we're talking Mysterious New Mexico, Miracles, Magic, and Monsters in the Land of Enchantment. Links are up at Grand Conspiracy for you to go to Ben's website, as well as links are up for you to get a copy of the book. Before the break, Ben, we were kind of talking about these cryptids and how there's several things going against them as far as the potential for their existence. But, I mean, of course, sightings persist, and, specifically talking about the Thunderbird, why is it that you think that they persist? Do you think it's misdiagnosis of large birds? I mean, because there's birds out there, I know mentioned in the book, that the condor, the California condor could possibly have moved. It's not that big of a stretch to think that there would be a condor in New Mexico from, California, and that's quite a large bird. I mean, and that's something that I think is kind of amazing. It's a small population of a large bird, but it's a very small population, and yet people still see that on a regular basis, enough to identify it, photograph it, and do all kinds of things with it. And I've got to think, with all the birders out there, that we would have a really cool picture, at least one or two, of the Thunderbird.
You would think. I mean, this is there's a couple aspects to it. One is that what people are commonly referring to as Thunderbirds, and Mark Hall, for example, has written on this as well, as has Lauren Coleman and others, almost certainly are not Thunderbirds. And that's because if you the Thunderbird is a typically Native American legend. I mean, that's what it is, and there's different variations across North America and elsewhere. But the term Thunderbird specifically comes from Native American lore. And it's easy to sort of throw these things around as like, oh well, there was some big mysterious bird in the sky, we'll just call it a thunderbird. And I've encountered this before. I talk in the book about how, in my investigation of Ogopogo, the creature in Lake Okanagan in British Columbia, I investigated that for my book, for Lake Monster Mysteries, and also to some degree in my investigations book. I did investigation for National Geographic Television, and one of the things that I found when I was there was that a lot of times evidence for the creature would often include stories of Native American legends and stories. And you see the same thing with Bigfoot, for example, where people say, well, this Native American story told for 200 years talks about a wild man in the woods. Well, yes and no. You can't take Native American legends and lore as eyewitness accounts, because they're not. They serve a variety of functions. They're not eyewitness accounts of anything. They're stories and legends, and that doesn't mean there might not be a grain of truth to them. That you also can't just rope it in and say, oh well, this is evidence for this. No, it's not. And you saw the same thing with Lake Okanagan and Ogopogo, where stories of a water spirit said to dwell in Lake Okanagan were being sort of roped in and counted as historical, the Ogopogo lake monster. But yet, if you actually read the legends, and I talk about this a little bit in that chapter, it's crystal clear that the Native American stories did not refer to any actual living, breathing water serpent creature in the lake. They were talking about a spirit, an aerial water spirit that would flip its tail and conjure up storms, a clearly supernatural creature. So the people that try to bring in this progenitor of Ogopogo called Icht, or Naitaka, depending on how you pronounce it, they're simply wrong. I mean, I understand why they're doing it, because there's so little good evidence they have to sort of scramble to try and bring in there. But at the end of the day, the fact is that these Native American stories and legends, they're not referring to actual legitimate creatures, and that's the exact same thing you saw with the Thunderbirds. Is when I did some research on this. In fact, I spoke to a guy named Noah Nez, he was a columnist for Skeptical Briefs newsletter, which I edit, and he did a column called Native Skeptic. And he's a Native American himself, and he wrote a very good article on Thunderbirds and Thunderbird mythology. And he says, look, the Thunderbirds that the Native Americans believe in would never be seen by a white man. That they even would laugh at the idea that anyone, particularly a white man, had seen a Thunderbird, because that's not what it's not conceived of as an actual literal creature flying in the skies over New Mexico. It's an entity that appears in dreams and has various powers, but it's not a literal thing. And so when you're talking about Thunderbirds specifically, this is one of the reasons you ask, why do these stories go on? Part of it is because people don't bother to make a distinction between Native American lore and legend and actual eyewitness accounts. And so once you separate out the traditional folklore of the Native American Thunderbirds, which has nothing to do actually with the sightings that discuss in the book. I mean, I bring it in there because it's important to understand the distinction. Once you separate those out, there's very few actual sightings of Thunderbirds. There's maybe a handful in the past 10 years, and most of them can be chalked up to eyewitness misidentification. People who see something in the sky and they overestimate its size. And this is a common occurrence. This is not something I'm making up. This is repeatedly seen, where people will, especially if they're startled or they see something they don't expect to see, they will exaggerate, not intentionally, but they'll overestimate how big it was. Oh my God, it was 30 feet tall. Well, it was actually 12 feet tall. Well, whatever, it was big. And that's sort of where they go with it. And so I think that at the end of the day, there's enough out there between eyewitness misidentifications and genuinely large birds such as the condor, the California condor, that I think that's part of what fuels the stories.
I think that that's an interesting point, and it's something that a lot of people kind of want to gloss over. You're talking about with the Thunderbirds that this is kind of a totem symbol or something that someone would get as a vision, and then it's being kind of brought from that world into the real world by people who want it to be a real thing, and it just automatically brings to mind to me when people talk about the Ezekiel's wheel as a report of a UFO in biblical times, when in fact that even was supposed to be a vision. It's like they're deleting important parts of what this story is relating and what it's supposed to be, so it can kind of fit into a worldview of what they want the world to be.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, you're exactly right, and this happens across the board, and virtually, and not virtually every, but a lot of paranormal subjects I can think of, where, if you take something out of context, then sure, it can be. I mean, I think of, for example, the glyphs found in Central America. That oh, look at this. If you look at this in this way, it looks like this carving, this stone carving is of a guy in a spaceship. Well, okay, except that that's actually not what that is, and just because you, with no actual background or knowledge in archaeology or anthropology, just because you can possibly imagine that this thing that this figure is in might possibly be a spaceship, doesn't mean it's a spaceship, dude. It just means that you can imagine that. It's just, there's just so many cases in which, this is part of the problem that I encounter in my investigations, and it's more broadly applied throughout the paranormal, is that it's so easy to make a mystery. It is incredibly easy to do mystery mongering. And all you have to do to create a mystery is leave out a few facts. Just leave out a couple important things. Don't tell someone something, either because you're trying to actively encourage a mystery because you're trying to sell a book or a TV show or whatever else, or based on a true story movie, or that you simply you haven't done the research. You're not aware of the skeptical point of view or the skeptical answers. And so a lot of times this is what you find is that exactly as you described. There will be some comment that seems to promote this mystery. Oh, this is so mysterious. This is so weird. And yet they leave out important information that you need to, like, well, hold on here. Once it's in context, actually that's not so mysterious. That's not so strange. And sometimes it's intentional through mystery mongering and sort of, hey, I just want to sell a book and I don't care if people, people are misled. But a lot of times, I think most of the time, it's because people simply haven't done their research. There's not a lot of, particularly in believer books, whether it's UFOs, Bigfoot, ghosts, whatever else. What you find is that almost always, there are a few exceptions, but almost always in these books, if you look at the references, if you look at the index, skeptics are almost across the board left out. The people who write about ghosts, the people who write about Bigfoot, Chupacabra, whatever else, UFOs, very, very rarely do they acknowledge or have they read anything by skeptics in the skeptical literature, because it's an echo chamber, and so the information they're putting in their books is stuff by their friends. Their friend is a ghost hunter, and they add to that, or their own stuff, or whatever else. And it creates this sort of, again, this reinforcing echo chamber. And it's a shame because as a skeptic, part of what I have to do is I have to read the claims. I read the believer books. I contact and routinely interview people who sincerely believe this thing, because that's how you investigate claims. You have to understand what they're claiming. But on the other side, on the less skeptical side, the so-called believers, I don't really like that term because it's kind of too broad, but it's for the purpose of the conversation, I'll just call them believers. The believers will often ignore, or they're not aware of the skeptical answers to these things. And frankly, even if they put them in their books, they're not going to put them in their books because that would obligate them to answer them. That would obligate someone to say, well, okay, well, this skeptic, there is a skeptical explanation for this, but here's why I think it's wrong, whatever else. That makes them do a lot more work. They don't like doing work.
Well, that's one of the things too. You talk about the term believers, and the way I look at things, I kind of parse it out in like almost three different categories. You got the true believers, and they're going to believe no matter what. It doesn't matter; they just believe, and
Sure.
there's really no dissuading them. You've got the people who are disbelievers, and there's no way to dissuade them. You could present them with hard and fast evidence, and they're not going to sway one way or the other. And then there's the people in the middle who are open to inquiry, who are open to receiving an answer to a mystery, irregardless if it meets their expectations or not. Meaning, like, if I wanted ghosts to be real, but somehow the evidence came out to say ghosts aren't real, then I'd have to accept that. I mean, and I think that's where that's where most people lie. I mean, they might have a leaning one way or the other, but they're open to parsing the evidence, processing it, and then drawing a conclusion from there on their own. So I think I don't have any problem with you saying believers, because to me, there's tons of them out there, and there's also tons of disbelievers out there, and that's just part of our nature, because we kind of want that polarization, and a lot of us still kind of live in that middle ground.
No, I agree with you. I mean, that's I just I think that it's a case of where it's easy to it's easy to paint both believers and skeptics with a broad brush, and all skeptics are like this, all believers are like that, and they're not. There's so much variety, in both skepticism and outside skepticism, that pretty much any blanket statement is going to be wrong. Are some skeptics negative and dismissing and debunking? Sure, absolutely. I know some of them, but that doesn't mean that all of them are. Many of them are very open-minded and sympathetic and genuinely trying to understand. The same thing, when you hear people say, "Well, believers they won't listen to the evidence." I'm like, that's not true. Some believers will listen to the evidence. So again, it's easy to sort of just in common discussion and in common parlance to make these distinctions, but as you pointed out, I think it's important to recognize, acknowledge that yes, that there are different flavors of this, and yeah, you have the hardcore skeptics who would never believe a ghost, even if it picked him up and flipped him in the air a couple times and plopped him back down in his chair. Oh, well, that's just the wind. Like, well, no, dude, that's not the wind, that's a ghost. And then you have people who, if a Bigfoot came up and bit him in the leg, he wouldn't believe. And then you have people you have the hardcore believers who it doesn't matter what evidence you give. You can read my Chupacabra book and they'll say, well, I still think there's Chupacabras out there. Well, fine. There's nothing I can do about that. All I can do is present the evidence as best I can. And show my research and say, look, this is what I found. And this is the position I take with all my investigations in my books, is like, look, if you disagree with me, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. I'm not perfect. I may be wrong on something, and if someone believes that I came to a bad conclusion with my investigations, or I got something wrong, fine. That's cool. I'm willing to have a discussion. But my question is, what do you have? It's not enough just to say, well, I don't think you're right about that. My question would be, why? What do you think? What exactly did I get wrong? Where was my error? If someone can answer that, I'll be like, okay, fine. I'll listen to you, and we can have a discussion. We can have a debate. But if it's just sort of like, well, I just don't think that you got that right. Well, that doesn't mean anything, because in science, it's not enough to just disagree with somebody. You have to have a better explanation. You can't just again, doubt is as cheap as belief. And so when I'm talking about these cases, I want someone to have some background knowledge in there. And if I'm wrong about something, that's great. Tell me why I'm wrong. Give me your evidence. Give me what do you have that's better? What research did you do? And if you did good research, then I'll listen to it. But a lot of times I'll have someone say, well, I don't think you're right about that, because and I'll say, well, okay, why do you think that? I say, well, I saw a TV show last night and it contradicts what you said. I'm like, oh, hold on a second. So I spent 2.5 years researching this. I interviewed dozens of witnesses. I spent all this time on it, but I don't know what I'm talking about because you saw a TV show that said something different, and I'm the one that's wrong. Seriously? I mean, okay, whatever, dude.
So Yeah, that's, I just watched X-Files, and there's certainly aliens. It's
Right.
TV. I mean, and that's the thing. We need to kind of understand that from its reference. It's TV, it's entertainment, and there might be a little bit of truth disseminated throughout, but by and large, if you're using that as a reference point, you kind of are in trouble. One of the things when I look at the breadth of what's covered here out of the paranormal, there's certain things where I look at, there's certain reasons why I particularly like the mysteries that are presented here. Like for me, ghost, I love the fact that ghosts are out there as a mystery, because I think that's a mystery that's never going to be solved one way or the other, because just the pure nature of it at this point, there's no way for science to kind of explain it away, but also there's no way for science to prove it. So I think it's a mystery that will persist. Now, on the other end of things, why I like the mystery of cryptozoology, so to speak, is that there's going to be hard and fast answers for that. If a corpse shows up, and there's not much anyone can do about that. If we do find if John Lithgow hits a Yeti, there we go. We have a body. It's indisputable. It's a solvable mystery. So it's like almost on the different end of the spectrums is why I'm drawn to each of those categories. And with the UFOs, I mean, I guess that could be solved. I guess, to me, that's one of those things where if there are extraterrestrials or these crafts are inhuman in nature, then obviously this technology that is far surpassing all of ours, and there's no way for us to ever encounter these in a manner for us to capture anything. So they would, if they're out there, they would have to expose themselves. So I think that one is a mystery that we really don't have any part to play in. Either they're out there and they're going to expose themselves, or they're not out there and we're never going to see anything.
Yeah, I would agree with that to some extent. I mean, I think that, for example, I personally, I don't doubt at all that there's intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. I would not doubt that in the least. I mean, the universe is so big and so vast that I see no reason at all to think that there aren't other intelligent life, maybe human life, maybe not. But that's a very different question than saying, yes, and by the way, they've been visiting humans for decades, doing anal probes in people and designing patterns in wheat to communicate with us. That's a whole different set of issues. And, so I think that, the things about ghosts and UFOs and stuff is that, particularly with UFOs, is that the field is so saturated in conspiracy theory that I think it makes it very, very difficult to disprove it, because, and I mean, among all the subjects that I research, UFOs and conspiracy theories are probably the most closely linked. There's also some in Chupacabra as well, but among UFOs, I mean, inherent in a lot of the Chupacabra stories and mythology is that the reason that we don't have good evidence for that, the reason that, for example, I can't walk into the local science museum and find, pieces of a crashed saucer from Venus, is that the truth and the evidence is intentionally being kept from us. That's part and parcel of folklore stories and belief, is that there are people, government agents and international tribunes and take your pick, that is a global worldwide global conspiracy that spanning generations that is intentionally keeping us in the dark. And that's part of the whole story. And so because that is such a powerful belief, I don't doubt that that 200 years from now people will still be believing that that evidence of extraterrestrials is being hidden and covered up. So I think that's one reason why that particular story and that particular belief will go on. The question of whether UFOs have crashed or not and alien bodies are being held, I would argue that that's actually very similar to your comment about Bigfoot. I mean, either Bigfoot bodies exist or they don't. Loch Ness Monster, whatever else. I mean, once it's been found, the cat's out of the bag. Either this is a Bigfoot or it's not a Bigfoot. In the same way, either there are recovered saucers in Roswell or Hangar 18 or Area 51 or whatever it is, or there are not. And if they do exist, then we can then presumably someday we will find that and see them with alien bodies. And so to that extent, I think that individual specific claims about UFOs and aliens can be tested and can be falsified in theory. But again, in practice, because of the pervasive conspiracy elements to it, I think that a lot of people, they're not going to believe it no matter what. I mean, to them, the answer is always, the government's hiding the information, that's why we don't have it, instead of, well, maybe we have it because there's not good evidence. But it's easier to sort of blame shadowy governments and others from preventing you from having the evidence than to just acknowledge that, yeah, we really don't have the evidence.
That's a very good point, and I know that the conspiracy theories out there, I don't really, honestly, even though I'm the Grand Dark Conspiracy, don't cover a lot of those. I think I've had like one conspiracy show over the 6 years, which I think is pretty funny.
That is ironic.
I think it's
something you want to tell us? Is someone keeping you from doing that? Who's paying you off, man?
It's Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. They won't let me do it. We're talking with Ben Radford. It's Mysterious New Mexico. That's the book we've been discussing tonight with him. Links are up at granddarkconspiracy.com for both his website and the book. Get yourself a copy. It's a fantastic read. And like I said, it gives you some insight on really a proper way to investigate these mysteries. And we're going to go ahead and take our last break of the evening, and we'll be right back with Ben on the other side of the break. And we're back. We're with Benjamin Radford tonight, and we're talking Mysterious New Mexico. Links are up at granddarkconspiracy.com, and I would encourage you all to go out there to link up to his website, because there's a lot more information out there on his website that you can grab a hold of outside of just the book, and then get yourself a copy of the book, which has this magnificent illustration on the front, Ben. It's possibly the creepiest photo that I've ever seen on a cover, and I'm very interested in, how that all came about.
Yeah, it is a disturbing cover. I will admit that it's a photograph, and it's a real photograph. It's not photoshopped or anything. It's a real photograph of a sort of either undead or dead crone old woman with white hair, and she has spiders coming out of her mouth, and she's holding a baby who's sleeping peacefully. And it is a creepy-ass cover. I'll be the first to admit that. And it's actually fascinating to sort of see the reaction that I've gotten. So far, it's running about 70-30. 70% love it, and they're like, "Oh my God, that is so creepy. I love it." And other people are like, "Get that away from me. I don't want to see that." One woman said, I love your previous books. I would love to buy your book, but I can't deal with that cover." To which I said, "Well, tell you, give me a magic marker. I will personally blot out the cover, and you'll buy the book. It's only $25." And so we got a good laugh out of that. But yeah, it's a polarizing cover, and it's fascinating. There's a little bit of a story behind it, which is that the photographer is a guy named Josh Hoffine, Hoffine. And Josh Hoffine is a fairly well-known horror photographer in some circles, and he and I were both guests at a horror/paranormal conference in Lexington, Kentucky, if I recall correctly. And he was there sort of showing off his photographs, and I was there. I was giving a talk on something, I think Ghost or something, and I also had a new board game called Playing Gods, which was out for a while. And I was manning the table, and as one does after a couple hours, you sort of get tired and stretch. And so I was walking around, and I saw his work, and it was really interesting stuff. And he does a variety of stuff. And I met him, and I ended up buying a couple of his prints. In fact, I have a couple of his photographs hanging in my house. And so when I was completing the book about a year and a half ago, for the chapter on La Llorona, for those who don't know, it's one of the chapters in the book, and it's a sort of a evil ghost spirit that's said to haunt New Mexico, and not just New Mexico, but other places as well, but including New Mexico. It's a woman who drowned her children and is allegedly seen walking along rivers and ditches looking for children to abduct, to replace her own children. And there's lots of stories about La Llorona throughout New Mexico and elsewhere. And so she's one of the chapters. It's a fascinating story. It involves folklore and urban legends and the vanishing hitchhiker story and sirens and all sorts of cool stuff. But anyway, when I was creating that chapter, when I was finishing writing that chapter, I was looking for illustrations, because it's kind of hard to. I mean, no one's ever photographed La Llorona. So it's kind of hard to find an illustration. And I remembered that Hoffine had done this photograph, and so I contacted him and said, can I use this? He's like, yeah, that's fine. So, so I used it in an internal chapter. It's I forgot what page it's on, but it's there in the book as the opening to the La Llorona chapter.
224.
Yes, 224, and it's right there. And so I was like, yeah, this is kind of cool. And so that was fine. He's fine with that. And then about a month after that, I got the mock cover from UNM Press, and they said, "What do you think of the cover?" I'm like, "Wow." Number one, that's creeping me out. I gotta go change my underwear. Number two, I didn't get permission for that, so I don't know if you can use it because I only got permission as an interior illustration. And they're like, "No, we contacted him. He's fine with it. He loves it." Lost. I'm like, "Go for it." So that's the story of the cover. So it's actually not, strictly speaking, it's not, as far as I know, meant to actually depict La Llorona. It's a photograph called Swarm. But it's similar enough to La Llorona, and actually includes a lot of the elements of the La Llorona story that it's pretty close, and so I figured it would work for that.
Close enough. I tell you, that immediately drew to my mind La Llorona. And that's always been and I wish we had more time, but that's always been a particular piece of folklore that fascinating because it's kind of almost like this cross-pollination. It's like you said, it's got the vanishing hitchhiker, it's got the abduction, so it draws to mind a lot of Celtic folklore, the banshee,
Exactly.
the fairies, abducting children and bringing them back with changelings and things like that. So it's like, to me, that's a particular interesting folklore because I know it's kind of more from the Mexican or a Latin, perspective, but it also draws parallels between, like I said, the Celtic folklore.
Yeah, absolutely, and I love the folklore side of it. I mean, I've always been fascinated by folklore. Folklore has played an important part in a lot of my investigations, especially, for example, in my Chupacabra book. I mean, there's a lot of information about the history of the Chupacabra, and in my book, I trace it back to, for example, European vampire folklore and things like that. So a lot of what I do is folklore research. Again, I don't just stop and say, "Oh, here's the story. This is interesting." But I try and draw connections and parallels between what we're seeing in the folklore and what we're seeing in reports in real life. And so that was one of the reasons I was especially fascinated by the La Llorona story. It gave me a chance to really bring in and dig deep into the folklore again, including the banshee. Stories and the woman who wails for the dead, and in some versions of the story, people who hear the howling wind in the night, they'll hear their names or the names of people who either have died or will die, and so there's this whole prophetic element to it. And of course that ties in with La Llorona because in many cases when people hear the wind in the trees here in New Mexico or late at night, they'll say that's La Llorona calling for her children, saying mis hijos, my sons, where are you? And so it's used as a sort of as a boogeyman, a boogie woman, to tell for parents to say, don't go out and don't go play near the river because La Llorona will get you. And in fact, here in Albuquerque, when I was a kid growing up, the local public safety department actually used an image of La Llorona in their public safety campaigns, and there was a sign saying, "Ditches are deadly, stay away." And there was a drawing of La Llorona. So it's a fascinating way of co-opting a pre-existing folklore and sort of scare lore story in a narrative into public safety concerns. And so that's one of the fascinating things that go into the book is the whole notion of using social control. How do we as a society get people to do what we want them to do, particularly children? And one answer is we scare them. We say, if you do this, the La Llorona will get you. Don't do bad things. Don't go play near the river. Don't do that because bad things will happen to you. And there's actually the flip side of that, for example, is Santa Claus, where we tell kids, not if you do bad things will happen to you. We'll say if you do good things will happen to you. So if you're a good boy, Santa Claus will bring you a new PlayStation or toy or whatever else. And so that's one of the things I find especially fascinating about the La Llorona story in particular is all the different variations and all the different ways that the narrative is used in our culture and our society.
Ben, we're at the end of the interview, and I want to encourage all the listeners to go out to grandartconspiracy.com, link up to Ben's website, get a copy of Mysterious New Mexico for yourself, because it covers the whole spectrum of the paranormal. Ben, it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you. I want to thank you for coming on and talking about the book, and I'd love to have you back again soon, sometime, to just discuss flat-out paranormal and, maybe get you to give some tips to a lot of the investigators out there on how to become more scientific.
Sure, absolutely. I'd be glad to. There's, I did a book called Scientific Paranormal Investigation: How to Solve Unexplained Mysteries. There's a lot in there, but yeah, I'm always happy to share tips and it's and try and bring. I mean, that's really what I try to do I try to bring science to it. And so, I don't make fun of people who investigate ghosts or Bigfoot or the miracles or else, because I do that. I find it important and fascinating, and these are interesting subjects. My position is, if you're going to do it, then do it right. If you're going to spend your time researching these things, then bring science to it, because science is the only way that you're going to prove this one way or the other, and get the support of the public and the scientific community. And so that's one of the things that I hope people take from my books and my research is these are great subjects, these are fascinating. Yeah. So, I mean, my position is, these are fascinating subjects. Who doesn't love ghosts and monsters and Bigfoot and all the other things? But if you're going to do the research, if you're going to do these investigations, then do it. But do it using science, do it using good critical thinking skills.